"There is no passenger named Naomi Brooks in first class," Emily Carter announced with practiced confidence, her voice carrying far enough for every traveler in the premium cabin to hear. The conversations around polished leather seats faded into uneasy silence as curious eyes turned toward seat 2A, where a composed black woman in a charcoal sweater, dark jeans, and white sneakers looked up without the slightest trace of panic. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. She simply met Emily's stare with calm eyes that suggested she had seen this moment before, even if she had hoped never to see it again. Emily held a tablet against her chest like it was the final authority. "Your name isn't in the system anymore," she continued. "You'll need to gather your things and move to economy before we close the boarding door." A middle-aged businessman folded his newspaper. A young mother quietly lowered her headphones. Across the aisle, a retired teacher frowned, sensing something that didn't fit. Naomi glanced once at the boarding pass resting neatly on her lap. The words "First Class, Seat 2A" were still printed in bold black letters. 10 minutes earlier, the gate scanner had flashed green, accompanied by the familiar confirmation tone every frequent traveler recognized. Nothing about the process had suggested a problem until this exact moment. Emily tapped the screen again, then tilted it slightly so another flight attendant could see. "No record," she whispered, just loudly enough for nearby passengers to overhear. "Looks like she boarded by mistake." The younger attendant hesitated, her brow tightening for only a second before she nodded without speaking. Naomi remained seated. Her carry-on rested perfectly beneath the seat in front of her, her phone face down beside a leather notebook worn from years of travel. She looked less like someone preparing for a confrontation and more like someone waiting for a delayed meeting to begin. That composure unsettled Emily far more than anger would have. "Ma'am," Emily said again, forcing a smile that never reached her eyes. "Please cooperate so we don't delay the flight." Naomi slowly picked up her boarding pass and examined it as though reading it for the first time. Then she looked out the oval window where baggage crews moved across the ramp beneath the late afternoon sun. The aircraft hadn't pushed back yet. The cabin door was still open. Time, she realized, was still on her side. 3 rows behind her, a law student quietly unlocked his phone. Not to post anything online, not yet, but because something about the exchange felt wrong. Across the aisle, an elderly woman leaned toward her husband and whispered, "She hasn't done a single thing." Emily ignored the murmurs growing around her. She reached for her tablet once more, her fingers moving quickly across the screen before locking it with a satisfied tap. No one noticed the subtle smile that crossed her face. No one except the newest member of the cabin crew, who had watched the display moments earlier and could have sworn the name Naomi Brooks had been there. She blinked, wondering if she had imagined it. Naomi finally spoke, her voice so calm that several passengers leaned closer just to hear. "Records don't disappear by themselves." Emily folded her arms. Today's record did. Neither woman moved. The cabin seemed to hold its breath as the invisible line between authority and truth grew thinner with every passing second. Naomi Brooks rested the boarding pass gently on her notebook as if nothing unusual had happened, while the growing silence around her became louder than any argument. She had learned years ago that people often revealed far more about themselves when no one interrupted them. Emily Carter mistook that silence for surrender. She did not realize it was patience. Naomi had boarded this flight exactly the way she had planned. No tailored suit, no designer handbag, no recognizable jewelry. Her hair was neatly pulled back, and the only watch on her wrist was one she had owned for nearly a decade. Anyone walking past her would have assumed she was another business traveler returning home after an ordinary week. That assumption was precisely why she had chosen this flight. For the past 6 months, anonymous customer reports had continued arriving at corporate headquarters describing premium passengers who claimed they were treated differently because of how they looked rather than what they had purchased. The complaints rarely contained obvious language about race. Instead, they described suspicious questions, unnecessary seat changes, and unexplained challenges to valid boarding passes. Most investigations ended with the same conclusion: insufficient evidence. Naomi never liked those words. Evidence only remained invisible when nobody bothered to look closely enough. So she decided to look herself. She had booked the ticket under her real name, refused executive travel assistance, declined private security, and instructed her executive assistant not to notify a single airport employee about her arrival. Even the board of directors believed she was attending meetings in Denver until the following afternoon. Only one person knew the truth. Her executive assistant, Claire Bennett, was quietly monitoring the flight from corporate headquarters nearly 1,000 miles away, expecting nothing more dramatic than a routine inspection. Naomi reached into her bag and calmly removed a bottle of water. Emily watched every movement with growing irritation, clearly expecting resistance instead of composure. Across the aisle, a father traveling with his teenage daughter leaned closer and whispered, "If her ticket scanned correctly, how can her name suddenly disappear?" His daughter shrugged, but her eyes never left the unfolding scene. Near the front galley, a newly hired flight attendant named Olivia Turner replayed the boarding process in her mind. She distinctly remembered the scanner displaying a green confirmation beside the name Naomi Brooks only minutes earlier. She also remembered Emily stepping aside with the tablet immediately afterward. The memory settled heavily in her stomach. Something about the timeline no longer made sense. Emily cleared her throat. "Our records are accurate, ma'am. Mistakes happen at the gate sometimes." Naomi looked directly at her, her expression unchanged. "Systems make mistakes," she replied softly. "People make decisions." The sentence lingered in the cabin longer than anyone expected. Olivia lowered her eyes toward the tablet in Emily's hands. She wanted to speak. She wanted to ask to verify the passenger manifest one more time. Instead, she remained frozen by the fear that every new employee understands during the first months of a job. Around them, passengers returned to their seats, but almost nobody resumed reading or scrolling through their phones. The atmosphere had shifted. This was no longer about one seat in first class. It had quietly become a question of whether truth could be erased simply because someone in authority insisted it no longer existed. Naomi folded her hands together and waited, perfectly still, knowing that the next move would reveal far more than the last one ever could. Emily Carter took one slow step toward the front galley and lowered her voice just enough to sound professional, while still making certain nearby passengers could hear every word. "Please remain seated while we verify a documentation issue," she said, though her eyes never left Naomi. The statement sounded routine, but it carried the unmistakable weight of accusation. She opened her tablet again, shielding the screen from everyone around her. Beside her stood the lead purser, Daniel Foster, a tall white man whose expression hardened the moment Emily whispered a few sentences into his ear. He did not ask Naomi a single question. He simply glanced toward seat 2A, nodded once, and accepted Emily's version of events as though it were already proven. "Move Mrs. Henderson to 2 Alpha," Emily quietly instructed. "The seat is available now." Daniel looked at the display for only a moment before tapping the screen several times. A few seconds later, an elderly white passenger seated in business class received a cheerful notification on her phone announcing a complimentary upgrade to first class. She smiled, gathered her handbag, and thanked the crew, completely unaware that someone else had already been assigned that very seat. Naomi watched the exchange without saying a word. She noticed the speed of their movements, the confidence in their coordination, and the absence of any genuine attempt to verify the facts. This was not confusion. It felt rehearsed. Olivia Turner remained frozen near the galley coffee station. She had completed only 3 months of flight training, but one lesson had been repeated more than any other. Every system action leaves a digital trail. Watching Emily and Daniel exchange quick glances while the seating assignments shifted in real time made her pulse quicken. She knew the passenger manifest had shown Naomi Brooks only moments earlier. She knew because she had read the name aloud while welcoming her aboard. Across the aisle, the law student quietly leaned toward the businessman beside him. "Can they really remove someone from the system after boarding?" he whispered. The businessman frowned. "Not without a record," he answered. "Every change should be logged." Their conversation was soft, but Naomi heard every word. Emily returned with renewed confidence. "Mrs. Brooks, another passenger has now been assigned this seat. We need your cooperation so we can depart on schedule." Naomi looked at the woman now standing beside seat 2A, visibly confused after noticing someone was already sitting there. The elderly passenger offered an apologetic smile. "I do not want to take anyone's place," she said quietly. Emily answered before Naomi could respond. Everything has been corrected. Naomi slowly lifted her eyes toward Emily. Corrected, she repeated. Or rewritten. The question lingered in the air like a warning no one fully understood yet. Daniel folded his arms. Our electronic records are final. Naomi nodded once, almost thoughtfully. Electronic records are created by people, she replied. That means they can also be changed by people. Olivia lowered her gaze, feeling the truth of those words settle heavily inside her. She wanted to speak, but every instinct warned her to stay silent. Around the cabin, more passengers stopped pretending not to watch. Even those wearing noise-canceling headphones had removed them. The atmosphere no longer resembled the calm beginning of an afternoon flight. It felt like a quiet courtroom where every sentence became part of an invisible record. Emily believed she had erased one passenger from the manifest. What she did not realize was that every decision she had made was quietly creating another record, one far more permanent than the one she thought she controlled. Olivia Turner could feel her heartbeat growing louder than the engines waiting outside the aircraft. Training had taught her to respect senior crew members, but it had also taught her that accuracy mattered more than assumptions. She looked once toward Naomi Brooks, then back at Emily Carter, whose confidence had only grown stronger as more passengers watched the exchange unfold. Daniel Foster quietly instructed the gate agent through the open cabin door to hold departure for a documentation review. The announcement spread through the aircraft within seconds. Curious whispers replaced the routine sounds of boarding. Near row 3, a silver-haired attorney named Margaret Ellis slowly closed the legal journal she had been reading. After more than 30 years practicing aviation law, she recognized procedures that protected passengers and those that merely protected reputations. Nothing about this situation felt ordinary. 2 rows behind her, a father traveling with his daughter leaned closer and whispered, "She still has the original boarding pass." His daughter answered softly, "Then why is everyone acting like she never belonged here?" Neither of them expected an answer. Olivia finally stepped forward. Her voice was careful, almost hesitant. "Emily, I remember scanning Mrs. Brooks when she boarded. The system showed a green confirmation." The words landed like a sudden gust of cold air. Emily turned slowly, her smile disappearing. "You must be mistaken," she replied without hesitation. "Focus on your assigned duties." Olivia swallowed. I looked directly at the screen. I remember the name because I greeted her personally. Daniel stepped between them before Olivia could continue. "This discussion is over," he said firmly. "The manifest has already been verified." Naomi watched the exchange in complete silence. She did not encourage Olivia to continue, nor did she interrupt. She understood something most people overlooked. The first person willing to speak the truth should never be forced into a battle alone. Margaret Ellis gently raised her hand from across the aisle. "May I ask a simple question?" she said politely. Daniel nodded with visible reluctance. "If the passenger never existed in your records, how did she board this aircraft with a successful scan?" Daniel hesitated for the briefest moment before answering. Occasionally, the gate system experiences synchronization delays. Margaret's expression remained calm. "Interesting," she replied. "Because synchronization delays do not usually print seat assignments on paper that exactly match the electronic boarding process." Several nearby passengers exchanged uncertain glances. The explanation sounded less convincing each time it was repeated. Emily folded her arms, determined to regain control. "We are following company procedures." Naomi finally lifted her eyes toward her. "Procedures are designed to protect fairness," she said quietly, "not replace it." The sentence settled over the cabin with remarkable weight. Even passengers who had tried to ignore the confrontation now watched openly. A young software engineer sitting across the aisle quietly opened his laptop. He had spent years designing secure database systems, and one thought continued echoing in his mind. Every authorized change leaves a timestamp. Every timestamp identifies a user. Data could be edited, but history rarely disappeared completely. Olivia looked once more toward Emily. Fear remained in her voice, yet something stronger had begun replacing it. "I only want to make sure we are treating the passenger correctly," she said. Emily answered with a sharp look that required no additional words. Olivia understood the warning immediately, but she also understood something else. Silence would not make the truth disappear. Around them, the cabin had transformed into something far different from a waiting aircraft. It had become a room filled with witnesses each quietly assembling the same story from different angles, while Naomi Brooks remained exactly where she had been from the beginning, calm, patient, and seemingly unshaken, as though she already knew that facts, unlike appearances, always found their way back into the light. Daniel Foster glanced toward the open aircraft door before quietly speaking into the interphone. Within seconds, a gate supervisor appeared at the entrance, followed by an airport customer service representative wearing a navy blazer and an identification badge. Neither of them knew what had happened. They had simply been told there was a passenger occupying a seat that no longer belonged to her. Emily Carter welcomed them with the confidence of someone who believed the story had already been decided. This passenger refuses to move after her reservation disappeared from the system, she explained. The supervisor looked toward Naomi Brooks and expected frustration, raised voices, or demands. Instead, he found a woman sitting peacefully beside the window with her hands folded over a worn leather notebook. Her calm expression made the accusation feel strangely out of place. "Ma'am," the supervisor began politely, "would you be willing to step into the jet bridge while we review the situation?" Naomi looked at him for a long moment before answering. "I will gladly cooperate with any fair review," she said. "I will not cooperate with a conclusion that was written before the review even began." The words lingered in the silence that followed. Emily sighed dramatically. "She is delaying everyone." A few passengers exchanged uneasy looks. Margaret Ellis spoke again from across the aisle. "The only delay I have witnessed is the refusal to verify a valid boarding pass." No one answered her. Naomi slowly reached for her phone, but before she unlocked the screen, Emily spoke again. "Please leave all electronic devices where they are until this matter is resolved." Naomi paused, studying Emily with quiet curiosity rather than anger. It was not the request itself that caught her attention. It was the assumption behind it. Someone had decided that authority meant control over another person's dignity. That assumption reached farther back than this flight. For a brief moment, another memory surfaced. 19 years earlier, Naomi had been 24 years old, wearing a simple navy blazer on her first business trip after starting her company. She remembered standing beside the boarding gate, while another employee questioned whether she belonged in the priority line. 3 white travelers behind her had been welcomed aboard without showing anything more than a smile. Naomi had presented every required document, yet she still heard the words that remained with her for nearly 2 decades. "You probably misunderstood your ticket." She had boarded that flight eventually, but the feeling of being treated like an exception instead of a customer had never disappeared. That experience became one of the reasons she later invested in changing an industry she believed could do better. The memory faded as quickly as it had appeared. Naomi returned her attention to the present cabin. Nothing had truly changed except the size of the company she now helped lead. The same assumptions were simply wearing different uniforms. Olivia Turner noticed the distant look in Naomi's eyes and understood it was not fear. It looked more like disappointment. The young flight attendant drew a slow breath before speaking again. "Daniel, we should review the original boarding scan before asking her to leave her seat." Daniel's jaw tightened. "The matter has already been reviewed," he replied. "There is nothing else to discuss." Margaret quietly shook her head. The software engineer closed his laptop and whispered almost to himself, "If nobody wants to see the evidence, they already know what the evidence says." Naomi gently unlocked her phone without rushing. The screen reflected softly against the cabin window. She typed only a few words before pressing send. There was no dramatic expression, no warning, no threat, just one short message traveling silently across the country towards someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. The message Naomi Brooks sent contained only 2 words. Protocol 7. There was no explanation because none was necessary. Thousands of miles away at corporate headquarters, Claire Bennett looked down at her phone, read the message once, and immediately stood from her desk. She did not panic. She opened a secure operations dashboard that very few employees even knew existed. Within seconds, notifications quietly reached the corporate legal office, internal audit, flight operations compliance, information security, and the office of the chairperson. No alarms sounded. No dramatic announcements appeared. The system simply began collecting facts exactly as they existed before anyone had an opportunity to reshape them. Back inside the aircraft, nothing seemed different. Emily Carter still believed she controlled the situation. Daniel Foster remained convinced the discussion was over. The gate's supervisor waited patiently near the aircraft door, expecting Naomi to surrender her seat at any moment. Instead, Naomi placed her phone back inside her bag and rested both hands on the notebook in her lap. Her calmness unsettled the crew more than any protest could have. Emily finally broke the silence. "This is your final opportunity to cooperate voluntarily." Naomi looked toward her with the same steady expression she had worn since boarding. "I have been cooperating since the moment I entered this aircraft," she answered. "The question is whether everyone else has." No one responded. Olivia Turner quietly stepped closer to the front galley, pretending to organize service supplies while listening carefully. She noticed something unusual almost immediately. Emily's company tablet displayed a brief synchronization symbol before returning to the seating chart. Daniel's tablet did the same. Neither of them appeared concerned, but Olivia recognized the update icon from training sessions. It usually appeared only when corporate systems initiated an administrative review. Across the aisle, Margaret Ellis observed the subtle change as well. She had spent enough years reviewing corporate investigations to recognize the beginning of one. The software engineer sitting nearby glanced toward the cabin wireless display and noticed a secure network refresh occurring in the background. "Interesting timing," he murmured under his breath. Emily ignored every detail outside her immediate objective. "Gate supervisor," she said confidently, "please escort the passenger off the aircraft so we can continue boarding." Before the supervisor could answer, the notification tone from Daniel's tablet sounded softly. He glanced down for only a second. The screen briefly displayed a message reading, "Administrative access. Update in progress." His forehead tightened. Emily's tablet chimed almost simultaneously. She frowned, dismissed the notice without reading further, and attempted to reopen the passenger manifest. The loading symbol continued spinning longer than expected. Olivia watched quietly, saying nothing. Naomi remained completely still, almost as though she had expected this exact sequence of events. Claire Bennett had already initiated preservation orders on every digital record connected to the flight. Every boarding scan, every seating modification, every user login, every timestamp, and every edit made within the last hour had been copied into a secure archive beyond the reach of ordinary employees. Nothing could be quietly adjusted anymore. Every action now carried a permanent signature. Daniel tried refreshing his screen again, but this time another notification appeared. User activity review active. Certain administrative functions temporarily restricted. He looked toward Emily, whose confident expression finally began to change. "Did information technology schedule maintenance today?" he asked quietly. Emily shook her head. "Not that I know of." Naomi slowly turned her eyes toward the cabin window, where the afternoon sunlight reflected across the runway in long golden lines. She spoke so softly that only those nearest to her could hear. "The truth has an unusual habit," she said. "It arrives quietly, but it never arrives alone." The passengers exchanged uncertain glances while the cabin remained suspended between ordinary departure procedures and something none of them could yet fully understand. Invisible to everyone except those watching the system itself, the balance of authority had already begun to shift. Daniel Foster refreshed his tablet again, but the passenger manifest refused to respond the way it had only moments earlier. Instead of opening the seating chart, a gray banner appeared across the top of the screen. "Administrative review active. Access limited." His confident expression faded almost instantly. Emily Carter reached for her own tablet, tapping the display with growing impatience. Yet every attempt produced the same result. The authority they had relied upon only minutes before suddenly seemed to be slipping through their fingers. Around the cabin, passengers noticed the change long before anyone spoke about it. Margaret Ellis quietly removed her glasses and folded them into her lap. The software engineer looked toward the front of the aircraft and whispered, "Someone above them just entered the system." Olivia Turner watched every movement without saying a word. She remembered Naomi Brooks sending a single message and placing her phone away as though everything afterward had already been decided. The timing no longer felt like coincidence. Emily forced another smile, although it was noticeably thinner than before. "There appears to be a temporary network delay," she announced. "Please remain patient." Naomi slowly stood from seat 2A for the first time since boarding. She did not step into the aisle aggressively or attempt to confront anyone. She simply stood with quiet confidence, smoothing the sleeve of her sweater before looking directly at Emily and then at Daniel. The cabin became completely silent. Even conversations from the open boarding door faded into the background. Naomi's voice remained calm, measured, and unmistakably clear. "You told this cabin that my name disappeared," she said. "You told these passengers that I never belonged in this seat." Neither Emily nor Daniel answered. Naomi continued without raising her voice. "My boarding pass did not change. The boarding skin did not change. Only one thing changed." She allowed the silence to settle before finishing the thought. "Someone changed the record." Emily crossed her arms. "Our system reflects the official manifest." Naomi nodded slightly. "Not anymore." Daniel looked down at his tablet again. Another notification had appeared. "Preservation complete. User activity locked." He frowned, unable to understand why ordinary flight operations had suddenly become part of a protected corporate review. Naomi reached into her bag and removed a slim black business card. There was no dramatic flourish. She simply held it between two fingers before handing it to the gate supervisor standing nearest the aircraft door. The supervisor read the card. Once, then again. His eyes widened almost imperceptibly. He looked from the card to Naomi, then back again, as though trying to reconcile the woman standing before him with the title printed beneath her name. Naomi finally broke the silence that had filled the cabin for the past several minutes. "My name is Naomi Brooks," she said evenly. "I serve as Chief Executive Officer of Meridian Air Group, the parent company responsible for this airline." A collective breath swept through the first-class cabin. Olivia covered her mouth in disbelief. Margaret Ellis closed her eyes briefly, as though the final piece of a puzzle had quietly fallen into place. The software engineer slowly shook his head. Emily stared at Naomi without speaking. Daniel's face lost its color. Naomi's eyes remained fixed on them both. "You believed you erased my reservation," she continued. "You did not erase my name. You documented your own decisions inside the company I lead." No one spoke. The words settled over the aircraft with a weight that no announcement could interrupt. For the first time since boarding began, the balance of power no longer belonged to uniforms, tablets, or titles worn on jackets. It belonged to the truth, preserved one timestamp at a time, waiting for every person in that cabin to see exactly what had happened. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The aircraft remained connected to the jet bridge, the cabin door still open, yet the atmosphere had completely changed. Emily Carter looked at the business card again, as though reading it a second time might somehow change the words printed across its surface. Daniel Foster stared at his locked tablet, refreshing the screen over and over without success. Then another notification appeared, larger than the others. "Corporate compliance session active. Live audit authorized." Before either of them could react, the interphone rang. Daniel answered automatically. "This is the flight deck." He listened for only a few seconds before every trace of confidence disappeared from his face. "Yes," he replied quietly. "Understood." He lowered the receiver with noticeably unsteady hands. Emily searched his expression. "What did they say?" Daniel hesitated. "Corporate legal is on the line. They instructed us to stop all passenger movement immediately." The words spread through the cabin faster than any announcement could have. Olivia Turner felt a quiet sense of relief she had been unable to explain until that moment. Margaret Ellis simply nodded, unsurprised. The software engineer smiled faintly, recognizing the unmistakable rhythm of a properly documented investigation. Naomi Brooks remained standing beside seat 2A, saying nothing. She did not need to. The system was now speaking for her. Emily's tablet suddenly unlocked on its own before opening a protected audit screen. Every seating change performed during boarding appeared in chronological order. Original assignment. Seat 2A. Passenger Naomi Brooks. Status. Boarded successfully. Timestamp confirmed. 37 seconds later, another entry appeared. Manual override. User. Emily Carter. Seat removed. Passenger record modified. Authorization required. Not provided. Daniel looked down at his own device as identical information filled the display. Another entry followed. User. Daniel Foster. Seat reassigned. Destination. Passenger Henderson. Audit flag. High priority review. Neither employee spoke. Around them, Passengers quietly exchanged astonished glances as the truth emerged without argument or accusation. The gate's supervisor received a call on his company radio. He listened carefully before walking toward Naomi. "Ma'am," he said respectfully, "corporate operations has asked me to apologize on behalf of the airline while the review continues." Naomi acknowledged him with a small nod. "Thank you," she answered. "Respect begins with honesty." Emily finally found her voice. "I was only trying to resolve a seating issue." Naomi looked at her calmly. "A seating issue does not require rewriting a passenger's record." Daniel lowered his eyes. The interphone rang again. This time the conversation lasted less than a minute. When he returned, he spoke quietly enough that only those closest could hear. "We have both been instructed to surrender our administrative devices immediately after landing and to remain available for formal interviews." Emily's shoulders dropped. She understood exactly what those words meant. Olivia watched in silence, realizing that accountability often arrived without raised voices or dramatic confrontations. It arrived through documented choices. Margaret Ellis slowly stood and looked toward Naomi. "Thank you," she said sincerely. "Not because of who you are, but because you insisted that the truth mattered." Several passengers nodded in quiet agreement. No applause erupted. No celebration interrupted the moment. The satisfaction inside the cabin came from something deeper than victory. It came from watching facts prevail over assumptions. Naomi gently picked up her notebook and returned it to her bag before taking her seat once again beside the window. Outside, the afternoon sunlight still stretched across the runway exactly as it had before boarding began. The aircraft had not yet left the gate, but something far more important had already begun its journey. An organization that had nearly lost sight of its own values had just been reminded that integrity is never protected by hiding the record. It is protected by preserving it. The cabin remained quiet as boarding finally resumed, but it was no longer the uneasy silence that had filled the aircraft earlier. It was the kind of silence that followed when assumptions gave way to facts. A replacement cabin supervisor stepped aboard, greeted every passenger with steady professionalism, and personally confirmed that Naomi Brooks would remain in seat 2A exactly as her reservation had always intended. The elderly passenger who had been mistakenly reassigned smiled warmly at Naomi before returning to her original seat without complaint. "I am glad the truth found its way," she said softly. Naomi returned the smile with genuine kindness. "So am I." Olivia Turner walked down the aisle a few minutes later carrying a small tray with bottled water. She paused beside Naomi's seat, her voice almost trembling. "Thank you for staying calm," she said. "I almost stayed silent because I was afraid." Naomi looked up at the young flight attendant with quiet understanding. "Courage is not the absence of fear," she replied. "It is choosing honesty even when fear is present." Olivia nodded, carrying those words with her as she continued preparing the cabin for departure. Margaret Ellis closed her journal and looked out the window before speaking one final time. "Companies often spend millions protecting their reputation," she said. "Very few remember that reputation begins with how one person is treated when nobody thinks it matters." Several nearby passengers quietly agreed. The software engineer reopened his laptop, but instead of returning to work, he typed a single sentence into his notes. "Every system reflects the values of the people who design and protect it." Naomi noticed the words and smiled faintly. A few moments later, her phone vibrated once. Claire Bennett had sent a brief update. Every digital record had been preserved. Formal reviews were already scheduled. Additional interviews would begin before the aircraft reached its destination. Naomi read the message, locked her phone, and placed it back inside her bag. She felt no satisfaction in seeing careers placed under investigation. Accountability was never about humiliation. It was about making certain the same mistake would not quietly happen to someone else tomorrow. The cabin door finally closed. The aircraft slowly pushed back from the gate as afternoon sunlight reflected across the wings. What had delayed the flight was never a seating assignment. It had been a decision to judge someone before learning who she was. As the engines began their steady climb toward departure power, Naomi looked through the window at the shrinking terminal. Years earlier, she had promised herself that if she ever gained the ability to change an institution, she would never use that authority to seek revenge. She would use it to raise expectations. She believed every passenger deserved respect before recognition, fairness before assumptions, and dignity before status. Those principles mattered because most people would never become chief executive officers, major investors, or public figures. They should never have to. Respect was never supposed to be a reward for success. It was supposed to be the starting point for every human interaction. Naomi closed her notebook. After writing one final sentence across the last page, power is not proving that you belong. Power is making sure nobody has to prove they belong again. She looked forward as the aircraft lifted smoothly into the open sky, leaving the runway behind while carrying something far more valuable than passengers or luggage. It carried a reminder that the strongest leaders do not raise their voices to change the room. They raise the standard, and in doing so, they leave the door open for everyone who comes after them.